politics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Trey Orndorff, a political scientist at Oklahoma Christian University, and I'm joined, as always, by Ken Katkin, a professor of law at Chase Law School. Welcome back to The Politics Guys, Ken.
Oh, it is great to be back, Trey.
Well, we, of course, have gotten the best possible day to go for. We've got some really interesting stories this week. The biggest story this week is Amy Barrett, as she is the nominee picked last Saturday by President Donald Trump. But of course, Ken, as you well know, our colleagues decided to postpone their show so that they could, steal this from us.
Yes.
But we're still going to talk about it because, of course, starting up next week, she's already been making the rounds in the Senate right now. But next week, we will actually have Judiciary Committee hearings on her. But I just wanted to kind of start the show getting your perspective on the nominee in terms of their legal position as a potential Supreme Court justice, because something tells me that you're not going to be particularly happy with her. But I'm curious why. So why don't you start us off?
I'm not particularly happy with her. And of course, I'll admit straight out that, my primary and dominant objection to her is not a personal one. It's that I believe that this was a stolen Supreme Court seat, and that, that the Republicans either should have given Merrick Garland a confirmation hearing in President Obama's final year in office. And that's what I really believe, in which case I wouldn't object so much to them moving ahead now with the confirmation hearing for Judge. Do you say Barrett? I usually thought it was Barrett, but are you sure?
I might have just mispronounced it a second ago.
I wasn't sure either, but I've only seen it written. But Judge, I'm going to call her Judge Barrett because that's what I've been calling her. I think that since the Republicans established a rule in 2016. In fact,
they established a precedent. They established a precedent.
The precedent, yeah. Well, they called it a rule. In fact, Lindsey Graham said that he wanted the public to hold him to his words that this was a new rule.
I don't disagree, and I just meant to distinguish it, from a Senate rule or a Senate proceduring rule. So I was maybe getting a little too technical there. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
And of course, you're right. They didn't make a formal rule, but they some of the senators did indicate that they were willing to be held to the same standard themselves that they were.
Definitely, and Lindsey Graham has to be held to his own words.
Yeah. And he has to be, right. And so, for President Trump to come out the other night and say, I'm making this nomination because I was elected to serve for 4 whole years, not just for 3 years. Well, that's exactly the opposite of what the Republican Senate said about President Obama. So that really
it's the opposite of what Trump had himself said. I mean, we had a debate, which is, one of the things that that we're going to be talking about today. But additionally, I mean, remember, let's see, was it the second presidential debate where he actually called out Mitch McConnell specifically and said, look, you got to do what you got to do. You got to delay, right? That was President Trump at the debates, as a matter of fact. Continue.
Yeah. So I want to really say many of my objections are predicated on the objection to Judge Barrett getting a seat that really this is a seat that I think it would have been reasonable for the Republicans to move ahead now if they hadn't have blocked Judge Garrett. But I really think this is a stolen seat. Now, as far as Judge Barrett personally, I guess, of course, I had to expect that with a Republican president and a Republican Senate, we're going to get another conservative pick. And, I was no fan of Judge Gorsuch and no fan of Judge Kavanaugh. And so, it's not surprising that I'd be no fan of Judge Barrett either. But in some particulars, I do have some very particular concerns about her. She excuse me, I sneezed there. She had to She has written somewhat extensively both about the Affordable Care Act and about Roe versus Wade, both in her judicial opinions and in her prejudicial writings. And in fact, with respect to Roe versus Wade, she even signed on to some newspaper advertising and things like that, calling it an abomination. And so I think there's more evidence that she is a certain vote to overrule the abortion precedents and to overrule the Affordable Care Act precedents. And there is a vehicle in the court this very term to overrule the Affordable Care Act in its entirety. And if she's on the court in time for that, I think she will do that. Now, I think Gorsuch is going to vote the same way. Kavanaugh turns out to probably be the swing vote on that one. And I was on a conference call with Professor Stephen Calabrese, who's the co-founder of the Federalist Society, and he actually predicted on that call that Kavanaugh will swing with Roberts to save the Affordable Care Act. But nobody's thinking that Judge Barrett's going to do anything other than vote to strike down the entire Affordable Care Act. So I have those kind of specific concerns. I also have some specific concerns about whether she's going to be too partisan if any election disputes arise out of the 2016 election. I'm sorry, out of the 2020 election, not 2016.
Okay,
2020 election. Yeah, out of the 2020 election. And I think
it's a little late for the other one.
No, I misspoke. President Trump is explicitly stating that he wants to put her on the court for the purpose of having his back if any disputes arise out of the 2020 election. He seems confident, without even knowing what the legal issues might be, that purely based on the fact that he's putting her on the court, that she's going to be voting his way on any disputes that arise, which is actually an accusation that she's corrupt, if you think about it, for him to make a statement like that before we even know what the disputes might be, what the facts might be, or what the issues might be. And I think he has some good reason to think that about her. She does seem extremely partisan in the narrow partisan sense, not just in the ideological sense. She is someone who did change her view entirely. She is someone who spoke out that the Republicans shouldn't hold a confirmation hearing for Judge Garland in 2020 because it was the final year of President Obama's term. And obviously, she's completely changed around on that. And that seems to me to be a partisan change in the narrow sense, not in any ideological sense. She's 180 degrees changed her ideological position. She also, first came to prominence as a Republican lawyer working on the Bush v. Gore litigation back in 2000. So I think she doesn't seem to me like someone who's going to have an open mind if any disputes arise out of the election. And I think that her willingness to change her positions to advance a narrow Republican partisan agenda are quite worrying to me.
So it sounds like, if I can sum you up, is that your primary concerns are on, one, not her, the personal side, but rather in the fact that you kind of view this, as you were saying, a stolen seat because individuals like Graham say, look, situation's reversed. We're not going to do this no matter who's in the office. And then on the other hand, you're worried in the case that there is election fallout and or litigation that she ends up being a biased individual at best. Am I summing you up pretty well for that?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect summary of what I was saying. And let me say, I wouldn't say that about every Republican. I actually do believe that Chief Justice Roberts is a person of integrity. Right now, I think he has conservative views, and he ends up voting with the conservative bloc most of the time because that's how he views things. But I think Chief Justice Roberts tries his best to follow the law, and I don't see that in Judge Barrett, and I really don't see that in Justice Alito, Justice Thomas, or Justice Gorsuch either. I think they all have that partisan bias where they don't really try their best to follow the law. And that's kind of how I perceive Judge Barrett as well.
Well, can I ask you a question? Because this is something we've actually talked about a little bit on the show. We've touched on it a few times, and I've always kind of wanted to ask you directly. And that is, I mean, so the claim here, like the way that we know they're partisan is the way that we're voting. But of course, what is sometimes called the liberal bloc of the court has also, in large part, voted just as in lockstep. There's some interesting research from court observers and political scientists that basically suggests that ideology is more likely a predictor than law, regardless of whether you're part of the liberal or the conservative bloc. So but generally what I kind of hear as you say that is a particular concern for the conservative bloc, in that they don't switch or have a change in a way that you don't seem as concerned about on the liberal bloc, even though that does seem to be the variable, which is ideology. So is it really about being ideologically lock in step, or is it just the particular ideology that you agree with, and therefore, it's kind of ruled out by a priori?
Well, I think it's a really fair point that you made, but my answer to it would be, first, I do agree that the liberal bloc does tend to vote lockstep in cases where there's a lot of where partisans have strong views on issues. I certainly agree with that as a factual description, but I think that the court has been involved in a project of kind of radical conservative activism and changing law as it had been settled before. So in that sense, I think that if I would consider it to be more partisan and more ideological to be voting lockstep to make changes in settled understandings than to be voting lockstep to maintain settled understandings. And I think sometimes you don't always see the liberals voting in lockstep in cases where the prior law may support a more conservative position. For example, in the Affordable Care Act cases in 2016, the Sebelius cases, which mostly sustained the Affordable Care Act. One part of the Affordable Care Act that wasn't sustained, that was actually struck down, was the Medicaid expansion, and the court ruled that that couldn't be forced on states that didn't want it because that was a overly aggressive use of Congress's spending power, Congress's ability to impose conditions on states in exchange for receiving federal block grants. And actually, Justice Breyer and Justice Kagan joined the Republicans on that one. So that part of the holding was 7-2. So I think there where Chief Justice Roberts wrote part of that opinion that was adverse to the Obama administration, but wrote in an opinion that was consistent with prior Supreme Court precedent, the liberals did not actually vote lockstep on that. No, Justice Ginsburg and Justice Sotomayor still dissented, but you didn't see that typical 5-4 split there. So I think you can find more examples like that than counterexamples, and I think it's telling that it particularly in cases that involve elections, that involve redistricting, that involve voting rights, that involve even the outcome of elections, as in Bush v. Gore. I don't think a single Republican justice has ever voted in any case like that for a position that doesn't favor the Republican Party.
And as you talk about that, because again, I want to make sure I'm hearing you rightly, because in part, I think the argument here is that one of the things that separates the lockstep nature of the liberal bloc from the conservative bloc in that view is effectively how often are they voting in lockstep to overturn unestablished precedent, and then you kind of and then you move from there. And this week, I'll be honest, your words were kind of running around in my head a lot. I don't know if you know that, Ken, but I think about the things that you say. Because earlier in the year, we had a conversation about courts, and we were talking about a case, and we were having one of our minor disagreements at the time about, well, when and how should the court think about precedent, and when should it overrule? And I want to make sure I'm getting you right, but you said something to the effect of you didn't always want them to hold to precedent because you kind of wanted them to be the pushers of law towards, more expansive better views of kind of true moral state of things. That it wasn't exactly what you said, but in those kinds of terms. But now, and the reason I was thinking about that was, I can imagine a lot of conservatives saying, "I think the same thing that you do, Ken. I don't want this conservative bloc to vote for precedent. I want them to vote for a more expansive view of, say, life, for example. I want them to consider late-term abortion as not something that should be held because of precedent. And so for similar reasons that you're espousing, I want to see the court kind of expand, change, and alter the constitutional interpretation." What's your kind of response to that? I was very curious about that.
I think that's legitimate. I do think that's legitimate. I mean, I think if I think I have to agree with you that decisions like Roe versus Wade are embodying interpretations of the Constitution that are contestable. Not everybody has to agree that that's a correct interpretation of the Constitution. And President Lincoln himself said about the Dred Scott decision and I'm supporting your point here, Trey, that President Lincoln said that the Supreme Court has decided the Dred Scott decision, and as president, he's got to adhere to it and enforce the judgment. But that as citizens, nobody has to think that it's correctly decided, and that the way that citizens can play a role in this is to elect presidents and senates who will put different justices on the court who will overrule that decision. So I think that's completely legitimate. So as a sort of process matter, I agree with you that conservatives have every bit as much right as liberals to try to get justices put on the court who share their ideological vision of the Constitution, and to the extent that some interpretations are contestable, to try to seat people there who share their position. The two places I might depart from that in smaller ways, though, one is that I think that not every dispute that reaches the Supreme Court is genuinely ideological. Some of them are just narrow partisan disputes, right? So if you do look at a case like Bush versus Gore, which decided the 2000 election, there was really nothing about conservative judicial philosophy as it had ever been articulated before that case that would lead you to think that a conservative justice exercising conservative judicial philosophy, which previously had been held to be more states' rights oriented,
would want to move to be a more national take and basically say, look, and you as a state are finished. I think that's fair. I'm sorry, continue.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. So I look at that as a corrupt decision. I think actually, if conservatives believe that Roe versus Wade is illegitimate and they want justices who would overrule that, I have a lot more sympathy for that than for seating a justice for the purpose of deciding an election dispute in favor of a Republican. Because I think seating a justice for the purpose of deciding election dispute in favor of a Republican is essentially corrupt and doesn't really relate to these liberal versus conservative ideological disputes about the meaning of the Constitution.
I won't even attempt to disagree with the kind of your ideological take and say Bush v. Gore. I think that all reasonable people are going to look at that and say that was a purely political party calculation. I think really the only response there is to say I don't think that the Constitution ever envisioned a situation, and I don't think framers early on thought that the courts would ever be the location for the dispute for those kinds of issues, because clearly the goal was, and now again, I say clearly here, so I might need to kind of back up and say, as a scholar of the presidency, I think there is significant evidence, preponderance of evidence to suggest that early constitutional framers thought that the House of Representatives would more often than not be the determiner between more than two candidates, because no one would have had a majority of the cases. And even once you get post the 12th Amendment, where you have teams running, right, you have a dedicated vote from each electoral college member for a president, and then a dedicated electoral college vote from each elector to a vice president. I don't think anyone assumed that those kinds of decisions would be in the hands of courts. And so I think what you're seeing there as being ideological, I don't think you're wrong at all. I think that's a function of we have, because of an unfortunate legacy of the way presidential elections have continued to not be modified, we now have opportunities for a branch of government to handle deciding an election dispute that it was never designed to handle. And I think we're just seeing a crack in the institutional structure. I don't think there's an easy fix for that. So while I agree with you, I think that's actually part of a systemic problem where we see the court is going to being able to settle, presidential election problems in a way that our institutional structure, I don't think, was designed to do. And I think, in short, there is no positive Supreme Court outcome for throwing things into its jurisdiction that is not really designed to handle institutionally.
Yeah, I agree. And two points I'd add to that. In 1876, which was the last time we had an election as contested as in 2000, and it was actually the same states that were contested. It was Florida and Oregon.
Yeah, it is indeed.
Nobody thought to have the Supreme Court decide that dispute. Although interestingly, Congress appointed a special commission, but they put all the Supreme Court justices on that commission, but they also put a few more people on that commission. And so even though they maybe look towards the Supreme Court as the people that would have the stature to decide the dispute, they clearly by making it a special congressional commission, it was clear that it was a political resolution, not a legal resolution.
Exactly.
And that actually did leave some room also for some compromising, where I think the commission gave it to the Republican Rutherford Hayes, but he actually had to compromise and agree that he would end the military reconstruction of the South as part of his agreement to be awarded the election. So that kind of open political horse trading, I think that was preferable to just having the Supreme Court decide the case. The other thing I was going to just throw in there is that if listeners want to listen to Wednesday's bonus show that I did with Michael Baranowski.
This is past Wednesday, by the way. It's just a reason it's clear.
Past Wednesday, yeah. I also talked in that show about, because of what you just said, I thought a good modern response to that, and one that I hope that will be seriously considered if the Democrats win the Senate, is to strip the Supreme Court of its appellate jurisdiction to get involved in deciding any kind of electoral disputes, voting rights disputes, or districting disputes. And that is something that Congress has the power to do under the Constitution.
Yeah, and it's funny because that's an area that we would agree, even though I think we kind of both agree on the candidate. One last thing I'd like to just kick for maybe just a second, because I know we've probably gone a little bit long. But do you think if Barrett is confirmed, I get the feeling that her being confirmed in time helps Biden, and that her not being confirmed helps Trump? What do you think about that, just briefly?
I agree with that, but I think you might see the reverse effect in the Senate elections. So I think, I think probably in Colorado, Gardner's already dead on arrival, so maybe nothing could have an effect there. But I think in Maine, Collins is behind now, but I think if Barrett gets confirmed before the election, that's the nail in Collins's coffin. I think that costs her. There's no way she can vote that will not cost her seat on that confirmation if that happens before the election. I think that's why she went out ahead of time saying she doesn't think that the confirmation should take place till after the election. Yeah. So and I think that may affect some other Arizona. I mean, I think in a few states where there's close Senate races, it redounds more to the benefit of Democratic senators, I guess. But I think in the presidential race, yeah, maybe in both. Maybe in both it helps the Democrats more than the Republicans.
Okay, I was wondering what you would think about that. Well, another big item that we're going to need to tackle, and they're kind of linked, but we want to start with, of course, the presidential. Well, can we call it a debate, Ken? I'm just curious. Is that allowable? I mean.
That was one of the most appalling things I've ever had to watch on television that involved the government of the United States.
I'm going to let listeners in on a secret. So in the evening, I have a number of different I have a number of different friends that I get together with, and we actually play video. We're dads and moms who play video games at night, right? We put the kids to bed and we watch. So it was going to be during my video game time. So I watched it on my phone as we were playing games. So we were I'm doing both things at the same time. And it was a good thing that I did, because I think that had I not, that I'm not sure I could have made it through without someone to be complaining to and or shooting, because we play for sometimes we play first and shoot. Like it was therapeutic to throw a grenade into a room while you're simultaneously watching the debate. So I'd like to start with, the problem I think that this show sometimes is always trying to fix is this idea that one of the problems with media is the idea of forced narrative. And so I don't want to have a conversation about who won or lost, no matter how positive or negative it is. I'd rather like to ask you this question, Ken, and that is, think anything actually meaningful was learned or could have been learned on what actually happened? And start there. What do you think?
Yeah, I'd say yes to both questions, actually. First, I'll go with the could have. There were a lot of missed opportunities there because some of Chris Wallace's questions were good questions, and not that they were really answered, but certainly if the candidates would have responded in a more normal way and answered the questions, I think we could have gotten a lot more illumination about some substantive issues. In terms of what was learned, yeah, I think that largely my take on this would be that Trump revealed a couple of things that probably people like me suspected before, but I think they became clear to a lot more viewers. One is that he's really temperamentally unqualified to be president. And I think, maybe none of his supporters probably took that message, but a lot of undecided voters and a lot of suburban women apparently did take that message, that he really revealed his temperamental unqualification to be president. And I think the other thing that was revealed, and I would say by Trump's behavior, is that he knows that he's not going to get as many votes as Biden. And so I think he came out with a strategy there where he wasn't really even running against Biden or debating against Biden. He's using the debate to run against the American democracy itself, to run against the electoral process, to run against the process of doing things like having presidential debates, to try to delegitimize as much as possible about every component of how we run our election system and our democracy, so that when he loses, he can claim that something illegitimate happened.
Well, Ken, I actually wish I could disagree with you on the Trump just throwing a hand grenade into the process. And this is one of the reasons I just simply can't support Trump. Now, I don't think that Biden did a particularly amazing job, but I'm not really sure what anybody expects a candidate to do. I saw a lot of people on the left, I think, more frustrated with Biden than Trump. In some way, they kind of thought that he was going to come in, and they think, had they only nominated somebody else, that it would have been easier. I'm just not sure. If someone's just going to start the tenor of a debate, which is what you got in the first 30 minutes, with just being shouted over, I don't know what you really do with that. And I don't think you can honestly have a meaningful debate. Now, like you were saying, I think you might be able to learn some things as a result of that, but you're not learning kind of the substantive things. And one of the moments when I was really kind of frustrated, I thought one of Wallace's really difficult questions for Biden that he never even had a chance to kind of get to, because it descended into a, you don't support law and order, just yelling. Was asking him to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter, in that I am very much on board with I think the generalized popular sentiment of Black Lives Matter. But I will say that I'm not as comfortable with all of the institutionalized positions of Black Lives Matter. And I don't think that Biden is either. And I think that's a difficult question. I think that's something. How do you distinguish yourself? I wanted to know what Biden's response to that question was. And instead, we just get a shouting match over, well, you don't support law and order. And I'll say the other thing start there. Yeah.
I was going to agree with you. I mean, I think I was going to agree with you and say Green New Deal also. There's a couple of issues where Biden is running to the center and most of his party is to the left of him. And so it would have been difficult for him to answer those kind of questions. But Trump yelled over him the whole time and bailed him out, really.
Yes, he did. Because, again, I think that those are the moments where if you're trying to actually win votes, which is what you're saying Trump is not trying to do, and I agree with you. If you're trying to win votes, you would want to make Biden have to answer that as long as Wallace is going to focus on it, because you're appealing to people like me. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to convince some voters who are deeply unsympathetic to Trump, who have come out for Biden, to have to kind of, well, where are you going to stand on that, right? And he doesn't get that. And I think it lends to your interpretation that this is nothing more this was nothing more than a tweet war that was televised constantly. That was kind of my take from it. So on the Green New Deal and on those items, we don't get those kinds of outcomes. What did you think about Wallace? I'm curious about that because there has been just a wide range of opinion. Did he do well? Did he do poorly? And what can a moderator be expected to do under the rule circumstances? What do you think about that, Ken?
Yeah, I have sympathy for him. I think he wrote good questions, and if they would have answered his questions without interrupting each other, it would have been a good debate. I think he, had to follow the rules that had been laid down, and those rules included that he couldn't turn off anybody's mic or anything like that. And as he explained himself, he gave an interview to the New York Times the next day, and he gave one on Fox News the following day. It took him really a while. Maybe he was a little slow on the draw here to pick this up, but it took him about 15, 20 minutes to really realize that Trump had a planned, coordinated strategy of yelling over Biden continuously. And he did start trying to push back on Trump after that. But by then the tenor had kind of been set. I'm sure I couldn't have done any better. I don't know if there's maybe there's some commentators who or some moderators who could have been a little bit tougher. But I don't really share the. I feel like it was such an impossible situation. I don't share the widespread criticism, at least to the same degree that he seems to be getting it.
Well, from the right, he gets the charge that he's effectively taking Biden's side, and therefore he is one of the people debating with Trump. And then I think from the left, he gets criticized deeply that, he didn't keep Trump under control in a meaningful way and allowed the two sides to be equivocal. So it seems like you two push both of those views to the side, as do I.
Yeah, I don't know what he could have done. I mean, if someone wants to tell me how you control Trump, then maybe we could criticize Chris Wallace for not doing it. But I don't know how to do it. I don't know if anyone knows how to do it.
Well, so now here's the next. Well, and this kind of leads into two things, and we can maybe talk about both of them. And that is, do you think one of the things we talk about in politics is to the extent to which precedents, not just in the legal system, set really important institutionalized boundaries for how things work. So, for example, when we talk and think about, well, how does Congress function, for example, or how does more specifically the Senate inside of Congress function? You can't just look to the Constitution, but you have to do what scholars suggest, which is you have to look to the precedent set in the first sets of Congress where they kind of fill in the details. So, for example, what does advice and consent mean? Well, you get a negotiation between President Washington and the first Congress. And so when I look at any particular event in history, or when I'm trying to think about what's happening in this moment and making predictions about the future, I'm always thinking about the institutional trajectory. What are the precedents being set right now? And how much of that will move forward? And so this question for you, Ken, is if we have two more, and I don't think it's unlikely that the two more will at least in some ways be similar to what we saw in number one, do you think that precedent is, how much of Trump do you think will become a precedent institutionalized as we move forward into future presidential post-Trump world debates?
I don't think much. It's impossible for me to imagine that we get another president who's characterologically like Trump anytime soon. I don't, and I know that the Trumpist movement is probably dominant within the Republican Party now. But if Trump gets defeated this election, I don't see anyone on the horizon who could be the Republican nominee in 2024 who would act like that in a debate. I mean, you know the Republican field better than I do, but what do you think about that?
Well, what I kind of worry about is one of the things that I had looked at, and there's actually some research on, and that was there's a change in language over time. Now, I want to be careful about this, right? I have libertarian sympathies. I'm probably more of a libertarian. So I don't want to suggest that I want anybody to not be able to curse. Okay, so just as up, right? This is, I'm not trying to oppose this. But when you take a look at, say, the social media accounts and the interaction between reporters and between both candidates and members of Congress and presidential candidates, there was a barrier that gets broken into the run-up of 2016 where it's okay to kind of have that language. And I think a lot of people thought, well, that won't be the case. But of course, now we are not surprised at all when congresspersons or of any stripe reach out and curse at other members and or particular things, to the point of which, right, we even had a confrontation among House members I guess at the end of the summer. So I guess for me, I don't think I'm quite as optimistic as you. I think sometimes once you have these precedents, even if they aren't identical, I think both sides end up finding new normals. And so I kind of worry about, I don't think it'll look like exactly as we see Trump. So I don't want to make that sound dire, but at the same time, I can't imagine that the new normal will settle all the way back down, especially if that is what has been seen as making you strong. What do you think about that? Kind of, it's a little bit different than your view.
Yeah, no, I understand that take. Maybe I'm a little more optimistic than you. You could be right, but I don't think Trump is actually being effective in the goal of winning votes by acting this way, right? So I maybe he is being effective in his goal of delegitimizing our democracy, but I think in the future, the more immediate goal for most candidates going into something like a debate is actually going to be to try to win votes from undecided voters, and I just don't see how behaving like that really can do that. So I don't see the incentive. If normal incentives are in place for anybody to act that way.
In other words, the outcome isn't positive enough to reinforce the behavior.
Yeah.
So the other thing that kind of stuck with me is if we rewind the tape 4 years ago, take us back to 2016. And do you remember the SNL skit where Trump is debating Hillary after the first debate? And it was kind of universally considered that Hillary had beat Trump. And in that SNL skit, who played Hillary in the SNL skit? Can you remember that?
Yeah, it was I can't remember her name, but I have her name. She was part of. Yeah, she was part of the regular cast. I know she had been a recent graduate of Columbia University. I remember that part of who she was, but and I think she's still on Saturday Night Live.
She is. 4 years.
All right, let me look up. I gotta look this up.
As you're looking that up, she has this beautiful moment where she basically the moderator turns to her and she basically says, "I would like to give my time back to Trump," right? And at the end, she's like, "This couldn't have gone any better for me." And I think that was the feeling for many people, was the idea, this debate is nuts. Just let the guy talk and do his craziness, say his crazy things, let him yell. And that's obviously going to be a win. Hillary loses.
Kate McKinnon, by the way, that's who it was.
Yes, McKinnon. Okay, thank you. So McKinnon playing here is Hillary. But here we are again, 4 years later, and I can't help but having the nagging feeling that you were saying, I don't think this is actually changing things in a positive way. But might it be? Did we just miss this before? Because again, that was the tenor 4 years ago, and it seems like almost the same suggestion now. Well, like, it can't happen like that again. I'm going to win it because this is just too crazy. What do you think about that?
You're saying because Trump actually acted like that when he debated Hillary Clinton and then he did win the election.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think that encouraged him for sure. And that's why he is, doubling down on acting like that, but even more so this time. But I do believe it isn't going to work this time. Now, if it actually works, if it gets Trump reelected, then I'm going to rescind my prediction. But I'm taking into account my prediction that it isn't going to work, and that that the candidate in 2024 is probably going to be somebody more conventional. I don't really know that, and I don't have an idea of who the Republican candidate would be in 2024. But if we think of all the other candidates that were in it in 2016 in the primary against Trump, only Chris Christie even had any tendencies in that kind of direction temperamentally or characterologically, and I think pretty much all the other candidates, would have tried to be more polite and well mannered. And I don't know who's in the pool. Who do you think is in the pool for 2024? That's probably the answer to your question probably depends a little bit on that.
I mean, I guess, of course, if I really want to be the political scientist, a lot of it depends on who wins, because Mike Pence is going to be a clear front runner if Trump wins for 2024. Assuming that he doesn't win, then historically, Pence is obviously still potentially a runner, but I don't think that has not generally been a success story in that serve. I think one of the ones in there is Haley.
Yeah. Well, she's not going to act like that. And by the way, Pence is not going to act like that. When we watch the vice presidential debate this week, he's not going to act anything like Trump was acting.
No. Well, so now here's the last thing, and this is just kind of some context for listeners. And I know if you're listening to the politics guys, you are a politics junkie in some way. But remember that empirically, debates and those kinds of campaign activities do not change outcomes in meaningful ways. And you don't have to look any further than if you take a look at post, who thinks who is winning before and after for the viewers who are watching. It almost always matches up with the how did people feel about it before, right? Yeah. So, Biden wins by about 7 points among those who are asking kind of that horse race narrative question, which again, not shocking at all when you consider that he was already leading by about 7%. So again, you have to always be careful about, which one of these things, because I bring that up to Ken, because you were talking about, if this makes the difference, if this is the one that has us go decides the election. The last thing that I want to say about that, and then I want to kind of pivot from this to another option, and this is something we're going to talk about more, is this week we're actually going to have a special midweek show. So Ken did a special midweek show last week, and this upcoming week we're going to have a special midweek show where Jay and I are going to have a conversation. So unlike normal, where Ken and I would be doing the midweek show this week, it's going to be Jay and myself, and we're going to be talking and debating about why we support and not support Donald Trump. Jay taking the positive view, as you might imagine, because he's voting for Trump, and I'm not, because I'm voting for Biden. And one of the things that kind of at the end of all this happened is I have 2 sons and a daughter, and one of my sons, we have worked a lot. He works with a speech, he stutters, right? Especially when he gets a little excited or agitated, and he's worked really well at that. And so one of the things that really kind of just grossed me out at the end by the time we got done was I recognized that, Biden could have, he's an adult, he's an old man, he could handle things better if he wanted to. However, I cannot imagine, knowing that that's his background, the way that he gets treated by Trump just kind of disgusts me. And I needed to put that out there as somebody who, I can't, yelling over somebody who's already attempting to talk well. I don't know. It just thoughts. You probably don't have a thought on that, right, Ken, but
yeah, no, I mean, yes. I agree with you.
So, but on that, Norm, I want to use that to pivot, because the other thing that was noted as the debate was going on was that the Trump team ignored the Cleveland rules for social distancing, for masks, and has regularly ignored CDC guidelines. And of course, this morning, Ken, on Friday, we learned that both President Trump and the First Lady have come down with COVID. And so, what do you think? Does this mean anything for the election? Might we draw any lessons about this? What do you think, Ken? I'll throw it out there for you.
I mean, we're pretty early right now into the development of this story, so I don't know if it's affected anything in the election yet, and that may depend on how things progress. But it does seem to me that it undermines, to some extent, Trump's narrative that COVID isn't a big deal. That it's, some of his followers may even have thought the whole thing was a hoax, or some might have, had the impression that it's not a hoax, but it's not that much worse than ordinary flu. Now, that we don't know how it's going to physically affect Trump. I mean, he may, some people experience minor cases of it if he comes through it and doesn't have a very severe case and, gets better within a few days or a week and all that. I think it'll have almost no impact on the election. But if it becomes a more debilitating case, if it makes him unable to go through with future debates, if it becomes really clearly life-threatening, then I think it shakes a lot of his central narrative about how people are overblowing this whole thing, and it makes him look bad that not only couldn't he protect the country from COVID, he couldn't even protect himself from COVID. So I think that some of that's going to really depend on the progression of his individual medical case. I do note, and this is only the first day of this story, but
right.
he has completely vanished today, right? I mean, if it was a truly asymptomatic case, you'd think he'd at least still be tweeting or making phone calls or something like that. Now, he did make a phone interview with Sean Hannity last night around 9, but that was a few hours before he announced that he had COVID. But he seems to have gone into radio silence today, and I don't know exactly what conclusion we can draw from that, but it might at least support an inference that the case is a little bit more serious than completely asymptomatic or something like that. So I don't know. What do you think about all that?
Well, I tell you, the first thing that I thought about when I saw that this morning, woke up and thought, wow, we're going to have to talk about that on the show. And then the second thought I had was, one of the things that we do know, a lot of people have complained, there has been a lot of thinking that, well, look, not that many people are dying from COVID because they're really dying from heart disease, or they're really dying from, right, because they have multiple items. And that's really a misunderstanding of the statistics. One of the things to recognize, though, is people who have other conditions are, of course, more likely to suffer worse cases and or to have fatal cases. And it is, straightforward and apparent that the president has, like many Americans, is overweight. One of the things I thought about, he actually falls into that more. He's older, just like Biden. Let's be frank, right?
Yep.
These are grandparent age people. And he is clearly not, he does not have a healthy BMI. That's not an insult to the president. That's something that's true of many Americans. It has been true of myself, right? I'll just be honest. It's something I've had to work on. But that doesn't, those being sympathetic doesn't make that any more of a statistical likelihood that he's going to have more trouble. So, as you know, it's only going to take time to kind of figure out what might be happening with that. But the longer there is kind of silence, the more likely it is to say there could be a problem. And that would strike, I think, particularly difficult times for Pence. If somebody, I was kind of wondering, so what if somebody's on a ventilator? Would he even, do we see a moment? I know Democrats brought it up in kind of a weird way earlier, that the president's not competent, but there could be what if you're on a ventilator? What do we do with that? That'd be the first time we've actually ever invoked that clause of the Constitution. So my mind kind of went that direction only because statistically he does meet these other more higher risk factors for complications.
Yeah. He's got the comorbidities. The 25th Amendment has been invoked by presidents before. It hasn't been invoked against presidents before.
Right,
but
exactly.
So George W. Bush, twice when he had colonoscopies, he invoked the 25th Amendment himself and gave the powers of the presidency to Dick Cheney during those periods of time. But yeah, if Trump doesn't do that, then the cabinet might have to invoke the 25th Amendment on him if he winds up on a ventilator or something. So that
I was thinking about, so you don't realize it's going to happen, right? You're going to go in, you're scheduling a procedure, you can plan for that. You can't necessarily plan for, I'm okay now, and now 8 hours later, I can't communicate in the way that, right.
So yes, that would be a first. I do believe he'll get, Trump is going to get the best possible medical attention that anyone could get. And, he'll I think even with all his comorbidities, my bet would be he pulls through. But I think the question will be whether whether this seriously impairs him over the next few weeks and keeps him off the campaign trail, keeps him from doing his duties and things like that. And I think just that'll have probably more of a negative impact on him than it would on many other people in a similar position, because it so directly conflicts with what his narrative about the disease has been.
Yeah. Well, and the one last thing, I'm just going to push this because I think it's so important, and that is, if the president of the United States, in very kind of limited circumstances, by not following CDC recommendations, can get COVID, I think this just highlights for everybody how important, here at OC, we have the love your neighbor policy, which is, I'm not wearing masks for me, I'm wearing it for you. I'm not social distancing because I don't love you. I'm social distancing because I love you. And I think that we really have to be thinking in those terms right now until we can get to a point of a vaccine. And I hope that if nothing else happens of this, I really do. I hope that the president does not have, a bad case. I don't wish that on anyone. I don't want to see the 25th Amendment evoked for any reason. But I do hope something that we can gain from this is the idea, wow, this has happened. Look what happens when we don't take those love your neighbor policies seriously. And I think that's I've loved that that's the way we did it here at Oklahoma Christian. And I hope that others can think about it in those terms, right? It's not an inconvenience for me in the same way if I'm thinking about I'm loving you by doing this. I think that's a really Christian thing to do. I think it's a really religious thing to do. Anyway, one last thing, because we're kind of starting to run out of, man, Ken, we've gone long. So we're going to do like maybe just a teeny bit of a bonus story, because I think this is just a weird little case. But this week, Tucker Carlson was found, he had a civil lawsuit where he was being accused of slander as it regarded the hush money payments, where he actually accused a couple of porn stars of trying to extort the president of the United States. But of course, there was no truth to that at all. And so they sued Tucker Carlson. And what was weird about this, Ken, and what we've been talking about is that the Fox News's own lawyers, Fox's own lawyers, argued, their argument in their briefs was that the general tenor of Tucker Carlson's show is such that it informs the viewer that he is not, quote, stating actual facts, end quote. And instead, he is engaging in, quote, non-literal commentary, end quote. I've read the brief. You've read the brief. What do you think? I mean, this kind of blew my mind. And so I'm curious about the lawyer's perspective.
There is some precedent for that kind of a ruling, but the precedents are mostly established in media that is seen as much less reputable than how people might think about the Fox News. So I think that the Supreme Court had a case like this that involved Hustler magazine, where Jerry Falwell, the Reverend Jerry Falwell Sr., not versus Flint. Where Falwell sued Hustler magazine because they had run a cartoon of him, depicted him in cartoon form having sex with his mother in an outhouse. Oh,
wait, I can help you on that. It was an ad. It was was a parody ad. So at the time, there was a brand of vodka that was called, it was the First Time ad. And so the true sets of ads were always celebrities. And it was this double entendre where the celebrity's talking about their first time, but it's very sexual. But of course, the reveal for the ad is always that it was their first time with this particular brand of vodka. In the case of Falwell in the magazine, so it looked just like that. It was formulated like an ad. And it even had the Campari, I think was the Campari vodka, I believe, is the one it was, if I recall.
Campari, rum. I think it was rum, but it was Campari. That's right.
Campari, it was rum. Okay.
Yeah.
And so so it's this interview with, it's a quote unquote interview with Falwell, where he's basically talking about how he's screwing his mom in the outhouse with flies and all this other stuff. Yeah. And that, his mom looks better than a Baptist poor with $100 bill. Where even the interviewer is kind of getting a little uncomfortable. But yeah, so it wasn't a cartoon. It was that. And at the bottom, it has this little thing that says parody, not to be taken seriously. But it's in this teeny print that you actually can't really read. Continue.
Yeah. So, you remember the facts quite well. And so Falwell sues and says, well, that's defamatory and libelous. I was never in an outhouse with my mother. And, if people believe that this is true, it will harm my reputation based on this false information that's being propagated. And that would be a classic defamation claim. But what the Supreme Court holds in the Flint cases, but nobody could really take this seriously. Nobody could take this to be true because the source is Hustler magazine. It's not a credible news outlet. This is not this is part of a series of parodies. It's clearly intended as humor. And so since nobody could take it to be true, it can't really harm your reputation. Parody doesn't fall within the strict four corners of defamation because
another way to say that, because can I turn your lawyer?
Yeah.
Parody is protected speech.
is protected speech,
Yeah.
but it's protected for the reason that it's not actually defamatory. That
Exactly.
it can't really harm someone's reputation because nobody could take it to be true, and that's the defense that Tucker Carlson raised here. So he's kind of aligning himself with Larry Flint and Hustler magazine rather than with
South Park.
normal news organizations. His own his own lawyers say, well, yeah, when I said that Karen McDougal was committing the crime of extortion by
showing up at the White House.
Showing up at the White House. I was engaging in rhetorical hyperbole and opinion commentary that are only intended to frame a political debate and not really meant to be taken literally in any sense. And, nobody should believe that what I was saying was literally true for the same reasons nobody should believe that Hustler magazine's cartoon about Reverend Falwell was literally true. So he didn't try to say it was true. He just tried to say nobody believes it is true. And that was the successful defense. So he successfully got the defamation suit thrown out on the grounds that he engages in so much rhetorical hyperbole that nobody really takes him seriously.
Well, and and to kind of bring this full circle to finish out this show, we have to remember, of course, that keep in mind Tucker Carlson is one person who I have seen being actually thrown around as a potential nominee. Have you seen some of that? I just thought
after you sent me the info, I did not know it, but I guess it makes sense. We were just talking a few minutes ago about who could keep Trumpism alive, and he'd be a contender. I mean, if the Trumpist movement is the dominant movement within the Republican Party, maybe he is a viable candidate. I don't know.
Well, we'll have to see. Ken, it has been wonderful doing the show with you this week. And I guess we'll have to wait for another cycle before we do our midweek show. Because this midweek, again, it's going to be myself and Jay as we actually debate, as two Republicans debating, should you vote for Donald Trump or not for re-election? I'll be taking the point of view that you can't. How can you have a soul and vote for Donald Trump? That's not exactly what I'm going to argue, but it's close. And I think Jay's going to argue something to the effect is, how can you still be a Republican and not be on board with Donald Trump? And so we'll have to see what happens in the end. It could be a cage match. I don't even know. But that's going to be myself and Jay, and that will be our bonus supporters show. So one of the things I want to let you know is if you'd like to listen to that show, we need your support. So you'll be getting that. How do you get that? Well, you can head over to patreon.com/politicsguys, or you can head to our other page, politicsguys.com/support. And by heading there and by making a donation, you can then join myself and Jay for our special edition show on Wednesday, where the two of us are going to go at it over President Trump. Just one thing. That is the whole show. It's going to be exciting. But I want to thank you all for listening to the show. And even if you're not going to be a supporter, even if you want to miss out on Jay and I in some kind of Trump WWE match, I don't know. We still want to know that we appreciate you being a listener of the show. And I would love, there's a lot of different free ways you can still help this show move forward. And one of the ways you can do that is subscribing to the Politic Guys on the podcast app of your choice. Ditto goes for sharing those episodes. It is incredible. The statistics are clear that word of mouth advertising is one of the absolute best ways to make a show go bigger. And we certainly would appreciate you doing that. If you have a question, comment, correction, or just some random thought you'd like to share with myself or Ken, you can always reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. We also strive for civil and rational debate on our Reddit, which is at Bipartisan Politics. Again, that Reddit is at Bipartisan Politics. I have really enjoyed the tenor of the debate and the things that happen there. I would love for you to be there on our Reddit at Bipartisan Politics. And we're also on Twitter at Politics Guys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Morano, Andra Maskell, Daniel Toe, and Chris Wilkerson. Today's show was produced by myself, Trey Orndorff. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. I hope you'll join me then.